we're talking a little election this year during this segment of the program today. And what we'd like to do is I mentioned we're going to be taking some of your telephone calls as well because the idea of this hour today is to give a bit of a preview of things coming up and maybe even some of those things because let's be honest, we have had so much attention devoted unlike any other. I mean, presidential elections suck all the oxygen out of the room anyway, but this year, because of the nature of the two major party candidates who are running, it has gotten a lot of attention. And I think if you're running in a local campaign, I know Randy Staples had mentioned things have been relatively quiet in Idaho over the course of the last several months when it comes to politics. And not that things are ever unruly here, but quieter than usual. Well, that may be the case, but it may well be it's because so many people are glued to the news coming out of the national presidential election that they're just not seeing a lot of what's going on the local level. So we wanted to mention that this morning, and we're going to try to delve into, we'll hopscotch around from local to state to national during the course of this hour. Just quickly, I do want to remind people before we move along about my friend Dr. Christine Pickup, a doctor of audiology at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert, and she'd like to welcome you to new sounds and experiences if you're having difficulty hearing. A new hearing device is available which works with the brain to help those with hearing loss hear more naturally than any previous aid on the market. She's offering a 2-week free trial with the new devices. You can call today to schedule your personal fitting appointment. Open your world to better hearing. You can call Mount Harrison Audiology, 312-0957. That's 312-0957. One of the Musketeers is in studio with us already, and that's Steve Millington. First of all, welcome back. Long time no see.
Yeah, it has been forever, seems like, Bill.
We got into a couple of things yesterday about some state politics. But I've got something here I wanted to mention to you. It says, and I guess he pronounces the last name Rush, House Minority Leader John Rush is defending a campaign mailer that boasts about his ranking by a free market think tank, even though it gives him an F- this year. Rush says that despite the ranking, the Idaho Freedom Association calls him one of the most conservative Democrats in the state.
Now, that's not much of a compliment, I don't think.
Is that unusual?
The label that he would get from, what was that group again, the Idaho Freedom?
The Idaho Freedom Association calls him one of the most conservative Democrats.
The Idaho Freedom Association has a scorecard that they maintain on all of the legislators in the state of Idaho, and they rank them based on how are they voting, conservative to very liberal. Well, they don't say liberal; they just say conservative, and they start with an A+, and then they go down to an F-. And I think you said he got an F+? F-, okay. Not conservative at all. He is the House Minority Leader, if I remember that correctly. He is from North Idaho. I'm not sure whether it's Moscow or Coeur d'Alene, but he's from North Idaho and does well for the Democrats in the House group. And out of the 70 members in the House, I think we have I want to say 17 or 18 Democrats in the House. And so he is kind of the House leader of that, they call him a caucus group. And his responsibility is to keep them informed as to political issues evolving in the legislature and gets their feel for where are we going and how should we be voting and basically kind of a quiet polling of all of his members. What do you think? What is your thoughts? How should we be responding to this? And so he is kind of the de facto, no, not de facto, he is the leader of the Democratic members of the House of Representatives. Now, he is facing a significant challenge, more so this year than in prior years. And in fact, there was an interesting article that came out last week sometime, and the state Democratic Party has rounded up a pretty healthy war chest for them. I'm thinking the number was $160,000. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. They have targeted 3 major races in the state of Idaho that they are pouring big dollars into, the Democrats, to hold those positions. One of them is his first name Jim Rush?
John,
I'm sorry, thank you. John Rush, and
Or,
that
or I think it's John Rusci.
Rushi.
So,
Rushi, is
Thank
that the
you. I think
pronunciation?
that's right. Thanks.
See, now we've got not only
Now,
Portos but D'Artagnan joining us here with
yep,
the
we've got
Three
Randy Staples
Musketeers
joining
this
us now,
morning.
and he will correct all of my errors.
So Rushi would be like a French pronunciation, perhaps.
well, I don't know. I'm not sure what the origin is. I think it may be German origin, but I was just in Lewiston, and
Is that where he's from? Is
that
Lewiston?
yes, that's
That's
his
okay.
district,
Uh-huh.
and yeah, it's a very hot race up there. There are billboards up there that have been put up, putting his picture next to Hillary Clinton's, and say
Wow.
He didn't
base
pay for those,
he
right?
no, that was not him. That was the local Republican Party. But yeah, that was essentially saying that they're one and the same. Was
Well,
the
now I know
tenor of it.
that the state Dems have targeted his race as one of the three major races that they're pouring money into to try to hold their position.
Yeah, it was very close last time. It was one of the very closest races in the state, and the feeling is that he had been unopposed for a number of years, and the feeling was that last year he wasn't opposed heavily by a Republican, and yet the didn't run a very heavy race, and yet it wound up being very close. So the thinking was that if Republicans ran a strong race against him, they might be able to take the seat.
When he says that he is one of the more conservative Democrats in the state, because we were talking about the AP story where he is making that claim, but one think tank says no, he's got an F minus, but he points out this Idaho Freedom Association says he's a very conservative. See, because my belief is in a state like Idaho, some Democrats probably are very conservative because it matches up well. I had a congressman growing up as a kid named Stan Lundeen who was a Democrat. He was the first Democrat to win the district in the House of Representatives in Washington in 130 some years. And then he stayed in that seat for year after year after year. And one day I talked to one of the leaders of the Republican Party and said, "How is that?" And he said, "Because he votes his constituents once." And so we do have some of those people here, right?
Oh yeah, there are. If you're a Democrat in the Idaho legislature, and you're not from maybe one or two spots where it is a little different, the north end of Boise or the Sun Valley area to a degree, or maybe Moscow because of the university there. If you're not from one of those spots, then you have to. You can't go too far afield from your constituency. And Lewiston is culturally, historically, it's Democratic, but a kind of conservative Democratic. It's Democratic because of the labor unions that have been there.
Wouldn't think about people like Frank Church, and I mean he was a well known in the National Party, but I think he was likely more conservative than a lot of his fellow Democrats in the 1970s.
Well, he called himself a liberal as far as that goes. He even wrote an article to that effect at one point. But at the same time, some of the definitions were a little bit different. He was very much in favor of gun rights, for example. You would not catch him out on the other side of that, or a number of other issues. It's split in different kinds of ways than we're accustomed to now.
And hasn't the label of liberal uh, kind of changed considerably over the past 20, 30 years so that they're really much more liberal in their policy and their thinking?
Well, the definitions get changed a lot as far as the way that liberals tend to think of themselves. I'm not sure that's true so much, but it is true certainly in the way that they are described a lot. The labels of liberal and conservative have both gotten, I think, so torn up, wrapped up, tossed around, and all around trashed in so many years that I don't like to use either one of them because I don't think they're very descriptive anymore. If you look in Idaho, for example, practically everybody in politics will call themselves conservative at one point or another. Very few people will define themselves otherwise. So what does that even mean? There's a wide range of points of view in Idaho. It covers a pretty wide territory. So what does conservative even mean at this
Right.
point?
Some of them are Paulites, if you will. They follow the Paul family. Some are Trumpists. Some are basically people who are behind Ted Cruz. Some wanted Rick Perry. And all of those four that we just named all have a lot of differences when it comes to politics.
And there are
And yet
plenty of others as well.
and all four of them would use the label conservative.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so it's varying degrees of what conservative that those individuals are are representing to the voters.
So I'm not sure that the label really has much meaning anymore as far
So,
as that goes.
so do we want to start looking at how do they vote?
That might be a little more to the point, or maybe we need a new set of labels. I don't know, but
Yeah.
maybe how they vote and the specifics of exactly what they're for and against. That might be a little more to the point. Yeah.
This Idaho Freedom Association, if it's the same think tank that I am familiar with, they have a scorecard of various issues that they score all the legislators on, and so they don't change the scoring based on the individual. This is the scorecard, and then we apply the individual against these items on the card. And so if they give him an F minus as far as that, but they're one of the more conservative think tanks in Idaho. I think they're associated with Idaho Freedom Foundation.
They are. That's all part of the same group, and it gets criticism from some conservatives. There's a legislator in the Pocatello area named Kelly Packer, for example,
Mhm.
who is by most conventional definitions in Idaho would be quite conservative. Certainly a very business oriented Republican activist for a good many years. Uh, she got crossways with them and disagreed with a number of the votes that they selected. When you develop scores like that, you do that based on really a handful of votes, maybe a top dozen votes that you pick out. And which votes you pick out to focus on can matter a great deal in terms of that. That's how you
That
set your score,
that could really change the scoring factor for so many people.
and it does.
And I've seen that happen with two or three legislators that I know. This Idaho Freedom Associates, they call it the Idaho Freedom Foundation scorecard. That they say, I'm more conservative than that. I don't know why they voted that or scored me that way.
We have just about 30 seconds left, but you got to consider Maxine Bell, for instance. Some of the gun rights advocates are unhappy with her, although as she said the only people she heard from on permitless carry were people who said they were opposed. If you don't get the reaction, she's trying to vote her constituents' wishes. But if you're only rating her, if an organization is only rating her on gun rights this year, she might look poor in comparison to other conservatives in the state legislature. But if you go over to an education or economic issue, she might have a
A
stronger
plus.
numbers.
It's what do you choose to focus
That's
on?
right. Now, and let's,
Got about 20 or
now
15 seconds.
I'm going to hold it. There's an interesting point in the American Rifleman magazine. That's the publication of the National Rifle Association, and it came out just a week ago, maybe 10 days. And we'll take a look at some of the scoring from the NRA on Idaho politicians.
20 minutes after 9 o'clock. It's 44. Randy Staples and Steve Millington joining us in studio. Steve is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. And Randy, of course, the publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story. We've got more on the way. I have a couple of guests joining us in studio this morning, and we're talking some politics today. And this is a bit of an election preview. It was the only time I could get the two of them together in studio before Election Day. Randy Staples, publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing, and of course, Steve Millington, chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party, joining us in the studio until 10 o'clock this morning. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com, 923 and 46. Just a reminder, too, probably after Election Day, we'll be seeing Dr. Eric F. Jones in studio. He uses a holistic, systemic approach to wellness, and he's been doing this now since 1993 with master's and doctoral degrees in marriage and family therapy. Dr. Jones uses methods of alternative healing, sound waves, intellectual cognitive self-regulation, naprathy, naturopathy, medicinal herbs. These all help remedy and remedy and manage mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual challenges. He's accepting new patients and has evening and Saturday appointments available, 731-7178. And he's on Facebook. Eric F. Jones, PhD, mental health and wellness therapist, Eric with a C. Before we get too much beyond this, just quickly, well, Randy, I want to reference that story or that column from a newspaper in Montana where one of the editors has just blown a gasket about what he sees as a reporter from AP, maybe not even aware of it, interjecting certain words in a story about Donald Trump rally where he says it creates a judgment or a bias. And we were talking off air about how sometimes reporters don't even know that that's happening. And That's why I guess there's an editing process.
Well, that's true, and one of the things that you have to be careful of when you're writing these things, because I've wrote a lot of stories for newspapers. Still write columns for newspapers, but in writing straight news stories, and AP reporters are expected to be very careful about this. You do need to be careful about trying to interject too much commentary in it, and if every time you use an adjective, every time you use an adverb, you're a little bit at risk for that. And when I read a lot of news articles, I often kind of mentally just kind of strip those out, so that I'm looking at the facts that are being conveyed when those appear. Usually, AP I think is pretty good, because and they kind of have to be, because they circulate to more than 1,000, something like 1,500
Right.
daily newspapers, some of which run liberal, some of which run conservative, all kinds of different communities, and therefore they have to try to please everybody, which of course you can't completely do, but they most of the time I think they do their best.
I used to have to rewrite AP copy. I was always told take out certain words that might seem almost like we used to call them cop speak. People are not apprehended, they're arrested, they're not transported, they're taken to the hospital. But I do know that we were trained to paint pictures with our writing, and sometimes when you're painting a picture, it can come across as trying to swing the reader's view of what you're writing about.
Well, or when you're writing really intensively, when you're trying to take a reader inside a scene, you are creating a picture, you're creating an image, and that can be all kinds of things. That can people can interpret that. Sometimes people can interpret it in the same thing in different ways too. If it's a really well done piece of writing along those lines, sometimes exactly that is what happens. The same way that different people may get a different view from two different people that watch the same movie may get a different impression.
And Steve, you were on a topic in the last segment. We got a couple of minutes before the break. We can pick it up too on the other side if we need to. Um, are you
Oh,
having one of those
yeah.
seasoned moments?
Come on, guys! It's called a senior moment. I'm just so caught up in your conversation. I forgot what was it we were going to talk about, and I said, "Wait a minute, we'll come back right after the break."
Well, we'll get back to that then.
Oh man,
Here's a quick question for
that's
both of
embarrassing
you.
as all get out.
I've been looking at the races, legislative races in the Magic Valley, and even though some of the Democrats they're well-known people in their communities, they're not screamers and yellers, and now they may not have a huge chance of winning in such Republican territory, but the campaigns I've seen run, and maybe the two of you can reflect on this, have been relatively clean.
Well, they have. There have been a few insults charged against the two candidates running for office. They have not been really hostile or egregious. They're just trying to make their point and get people to listen to their presentation. We haven't got to the point yet where we have the constant barrage of negative ideas
Maybe
that we.
next week.
Yeah, we still have 2 weeks to go here, say, so it could get real interesting.
In a place like Twin Falls, that's probably wouldn't be accepted very well
I,
if somebody tried to do that.
I,
It
I
wouldn't.
think Randy's really on. Our general demeanor here is not one that would um, accept that kind of stuff very well. We seem to have a high degree of civility and decency and some old-fashioned ideologies about love your neighbors
And the
yourself.
newcomers seem to adopt those too.
Um, we sure hope so. Now we get an awful lot of newcomers coming in, and what we really wish, we don't have a problem with newcomers. You're welcome here. Gee whiz, thank you for coming. We just wish you'd leave your old ideas at the border and just adopt ours.
We've got a break coming up. By the way, these are at random, but this one, it's supposed to tell you what the tune is. It says, surprise me. Probably good for the political season. 9:30, it's 45. Randy Staples, Steve Billington, and Bill Colley with you for another half hour, talking some pre-election politics today. And I hope you can stick around. A couple of guests in the studio with us. They're joining us this morning. We're talking some previews, if you will, of election night, which is 13 days away, or election day. Most people will obviously, I think if you're listening to this program, you're among those voters. quickly, I got to share this with my guests. Randy Staples and Steve Millington are joining us. Bill Colley as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. A publication called Reason, which I guess is related to the Cato Institute, and it's a libertarian publication, came across a public service announcement, and I'm not sure the provenance of where it comes from, but they said that this is the worst PSA of all time. It's a little boy. He comes out of school and he's talking with his friends about Election Day. Take a listen.
My dad didn't vote.
Why not?
He goes to the gym every Tuesday before work.
Couldn't he vote after work?
Tuesday is a big TV night.
Your dad sounds like a total nihilist. And a doofus.
What about our system of checks and balances?
Your dad probably hates bald eagles.
Wait! That's the guy!
What's all that about?
Just drive.
Just
Now, apparently they're recommending that if your parents don't vote, that the other kids should haze you.
Okay, and that brings
I hope that's not the message they draw, but yeah.
one could kind of interpret it that way. Here's an interesting, let's talk about voting. This morning on one of the, I watch Fox News channel in the mornings, and so you know my biases now, one of them anyway. And they were talking about
You are the Republican county chairman. I think we figured that out.
So they were talking about the huge turnout of early voting in some areas. And right now, the focus seems to be on Florida and Pennsylvania. And they were talking about certain areas in Florida, counties they have identified, and the political campaigning process is so sophisticated, they can pretty much identify Republican strongholds and Democrat strongholds, and they've got this down almost to the precinct level, so that they could kind of track these things and see who's on first. Well, in Florida, they in a county that voted for Obama in 08 and in 12, the early voting is coming in, and somehow they can track whether you're voting a Democrat or whether you're voting Republican. I haven't got that.
Maybe they've got AT&T working with
I
them.
think Florida is one of the states that has voter registration by party, as Oregon does, and a number of other states do.
And even in the general election.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's how they would be tracking it. Well, they're tracking in previously strong Democratic areas, and the Republicans are now running somewhere between 8 and 14% ahead of where the Democrats are in those 5 or 6 counties in Florida. And he said this is early voting, and this is primarily Democrat strongholds, and the Republicans are percentage points way ahead of whatever the Democrats are turning in.
We've got a telephone caller with us.
Oh, good.
And, coming up on 9:37. And caller, hope you're patient. You're still on the air, I would imagine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a bone to pick. Yesterday, I heard Steve say that when Democrats hang together, they only have one idea, and when Republicans hang together, they have a whole bunch of ideas. But then right now, you say that if people bring something different from other states, don't do that. You want it your way. So if you were to listen to Proposition 65, which is going to pass in California, you'd have a heart attack. And to even think that California is going to put up $2 billion to fix just one freeway, the 405, in Southern California to make commuting better, you'd have a heart attack. So that's my suggestion.
Of course, they're spending a lot of money on a choo-choo train in California, too, as well.
Well, I hadn't heard about the amount of money they're spending. If I understood the caller correctly, this is a freeway extension that they're motor vehicles. I know that California is planning to spend tens of billions of dollars on the new fast rail system between Los Angeles and San Francisco.
They've moved that, I think, a couple of times as to destinations in the cities and the like.
But, I would have a heart attack with those kinds of things. Holy smokes.
But they've got a bigger tax base, obviously, much bigger tax base to draw from.
Well, they do. But
about 25 times larger?
But does that give them authority, right, or privilege to push that kind of stuff down on everybody just because they have the wherewithal to round up that much money? And by the way, the last time I checked in California, they are running a deficit in their state budget. So now we're going to add to that by tens of billions of dollars to build the fast rail train system down there.
We've got to take a short break, but do want to mention Steve Millington is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party, and Randy Staples, publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. They're joining us in studio. We're here for another 20 minutes today. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. We will try to squeeze in more of your telephone calls as well. If you don't know the number, write it down, 736-0300. Yesterday I said put it in speed dial, but that dates us a little bit. Wanted to welcome everybody this morning to our political discussion. We have an election preview going on. Randy Staples, publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing, along with Steve Millington, the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party, and me, Bill Colley, host of Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 46 coming up on 944. Believe we have a caller with us. And caller, you're up next. You're on the air with our guest. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for Steve. I understand that Governor Pence is going to be in Salt Lake City this afternoon, and was wondering if our local Republican Party has organized anything to transport people down there, or what. I know the doors open at 1, and the speech is actually at 3:30. So I just was wondering. Thanks.
Thank you for the call. We do not have any formalized plan to transport people to Salt Lake. We did this earlier in the campaign cycle, I want to say September-ish, when he was in Boise, when Eric Trump Jr. was in Boise, and there was a lot of people traveled to the Boise meeting where Trump Jr. was making a presentation. But I know of no specific plan for people to carpool or bus or anything else to Salt Lake.
I got an invitation the other day to a McMullen presentation in Jackson Hole, and I just thought it would be an all-day drive. So I passed on that for the time being.
Well, they had one in Boise on Saturday.
Right. I was there in town, but I was tied up with other things. We have a caller with us. Another caller, you're on the air. Go ahead. You're on KLIX.
Yes, I was hoping to hear from Steve Millington and his NRA list that he was talking about before a couple breaks ago.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's the senior moment that I had. Thank you.
Seasoned moment.
Seasoned moment. If you open your American Rifleman magazine to the center of the book, they have the scorecard, the NRA scorecard for all of the candidates for office in the state of Idaho. And specifically, we were talking about the kickback that Maxine Bell got as a result of her consideration for this concealed carry vote in the state of Idaho last spring. And if my memory serves me right, and of course, you're dealing with a seasoned senior moment here, I think the NRA scored her a B- or a C. But if you can get a hold of that, look at it. It'll be in all of the libraries if you don't have one personally. The interesting part was that the various positions, even candidates who are first time running for their first election, the NRA has researched and got information, questionnaires answered from all of these people, and they have ranked them with their scorecard A to F. And it's interesting, Maxine was not an A or A+. However, most of the other legislators in our area were in the B+ to A+ category. And in fact, two that I am tracking specifically that are running in their first election both got A's, and they have not been in the legislature previously. And so they had filled out questionnaire sheets for NRA and turned them back in, and then with just a little background check, the NRA gave them the A rating.
Randy has something to add here.
Of course, what you always need to know with something like that from any organization, whether it's the NRA or anyone else, is what did they use to develop these ratings? Was it votes on legislation? Was it filling in a questionnaire? Sometimes questionnaires are developed in kind of squirrely ways that can sometimes give you put candidates in position of having to answer questions in ways that they wouldn't want to. It puts sometimes questionnaires put words in candidates' mouths.
Can I tell you
Exactly.
that they can be hazardous too? A friend of mine was a very conservative Democrat running for a political office, and he was a popular guy in his district, and he got a survey questionnaire from the Working Families Party one year. And he said he always filled out every survey. He thought it was his duty. And he ended up getting, because his opponent didn't fill it out, he got the endorsement of the Working Families Party. And his opponent was able to turn around and say, these communists are endorsing him.
Yep.
And he lost the election by about 40 votes.
My recommendation to a number of candidates that I've talked with about this is news media questionnaires generally are open-ended enough and straightforward enough that you're reasonably safe most of the time in answering them. But from any interest group of any sort, I'd recommend don't fill them out.
We have a caller with us quickly. I want to get back to the phones just for a moment. Caller, you're up next on KLIX. Go ahead.
Good morning. Yesterday evening, I heard that in Texas there was voter tampering in that people were voting for Trump. Hillary was getting the credit. And I also heard that it was alluded that George Soros had significant financial interest in the companies that make the voting machines.
The other one that's come up is the company called Diebold as well, having some glitches, computer glitches and the like. There's a Simpsons episode where Homer tries to vote and it keeps switching his vote.
Gee whiz.
Their Diebold has come up in past years for about the last 20 years periodically, and most of the references there, and I don't think they've ever been proven in all that time, but most of the references have been concerns about whether they might switch votes to Republicans. So
And
So we want Diebold machines. We do not want George Soros's machines.
you had a follow up on the surveys.
Well, a couple of things on surveys. There was an article that come out over the weekend that basically said if the polling companies, the polling entities, were using the same methodology and structure of questions that they did in the 2012 election, that Trump would be way ahead. But they have changed the structure and the method of asking questions as poll takers so that they are skewed to answer the questions in favor of Hillary Clinton. And this particular one was taking to task Bloomberg and Rasmussen and Quinnipiac. There's another one, I can't think of it now. But he said if we used exactly the same methodology from 4 years ago and applied it today, we would probably be seeing considerably different polling results. And I think this goes back to Randy Staples' comment. They can put words in your mouth. And when I was running for office a couple of 3 years ago, you get all of these questionnaires from every special interest group in the world, and they're just piling up by buckets full. And so I had a close friend and confidant, and I said, Judas Priest, I've got this and this and this and this. And he said, okay, you want to answer the one from the news media questionnaires, but these special interest people, be real careful. Because if you answer yes when they propose a certain bill or regulation in the legislature, they're going to come back and wave that in your face and say, you're doing a double standard. You said that you would accept it. Right here, we've got it in writing, and now we got a bill on the floor, and you're voting against it. We're going to use this against you.
And they may define things in all kinds of specific ways. They may define a bill in a particular way that is not the way that you would define it.
Exactly. And so when you told me that, I started looking at these questionnaires real carefully, and lo and behold, question number 1 was almost a complete contradiction to question number 10. And so I'd start looking at them and I'd say, how can I answer yes here and yes to this one? Because they're in contradiction. And so it doesn't make any difference when you start answering those things. They are set out to entrap you. My view. That's maybe jaundiced, but
just going back to the polls for a second, it's a real interesting and it's a very challenging kind of thing to do these days. Partly because we're not reliant on landlines anymore. It's more difficult to. But one of the things that I always look at is after it's over with, after the election is held, which pollsters came fairly close to actually hitting the results pretty well. during the primaries, for example, the pollsters generally did a pretty good job of coming pretty close to the actual results. And there are political analysts who dismissed Donald Trump as a serious political force a year ago, who've said in hindsight, if we paid more attention to what the polls were actually telling us, and the polls showed him way ahead throughout that season, that they would have come a lot closer. One other thing that I would suggest real quick is there is a website called 538.com. Just
Right.
spell
Nate
it out.
Silvers.
Nate Silver's website. He does great, among other things. He tracks the various polls, aggregates them, puts them together into essentially averages. But he also looks at the variations between the different polls. Some pollsters have what he calls a house effect, that over time, just the way that they happen to do the polls tend to lean a little bit more Democratic or lean a little more Republican. And there's a mix of them over time. You aggregate them all together, and they tend to come out more or less in the middle. Uh, that's a site that would be, if you're interested in polling and how all of that is done and comes together, there's wonderful material on that site.
538's been one that I've looked at an awful lot too.
Got about 4 minutes to go. Will we see, because the national race has sucked up so much of the attention, and Randy, you'd commented it seems like a quiet, calm year in Idaho by comparison, but maybe just because we haven't noticed it with all of the chatter, and will that have an impact on any race on the state or local level?
Probably not a great deal. It could maybe have a little bit in southern Idaho, where I've been very interested in Utah, for example, where the polling now is showing the three candidates, Evan McMullen, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton, all running neck and neck, remarkably, and it's very hard to be sure which one of them could actually wind up winning Utah because of that. Southern Idaho, northern Idaho will probably cancel the effect to some extent, but some of that seems to be happening in southern Idaho as well, particularly east of here and east of here.
In Idaho Falls, he's very strong.
One of the phenomena that I heard explaining this third-party candidate, McMullen, he's running a campaign known as the I-15 Corridor Campaign, and that's from the Montana border of Idaho, Montana, north of Idaho Falls to St. George, Utah. And he's focusing almost all his attention down the I-15 corridor. And for good reason. That's predominantly Latter-day Saint religion population. And he is playing his Mormon card right to the top of the page. And he's just getting a huge following down
well,
the
he's running for governor of Deseret. I guess he's in good.
Yeah. But he's not.
It's a fascinating thing. I think people will be watching. We'll be reviewing the results of that for years to come.
Yeah, that's an interest. And so, is he really a viable candidate, or is he an outlier, or is he nothing but a disruptor? And so
it's kind of point of view, I suppose, to a degree.
It will be. But what effect did it have, and how did it play?
It will probably just be limited to this part of the country, but still, in this part of the country, maybe it has some longer term effects down the road
that we really can't see at this point. One thing, we're talking about early voting in Florida, and the Republicans are just giddy about that. We're getting so many more Republican votes in, and we're way ahead of the Democrats, and these are in Democrat strongholds. Well, this is not a Democrat stronghold. This is just something I picked up. The early voting in Twin Falls County began a week ago Monday. In the first week of voting in Twin Falls County, they had 1,450 votes cast in that first week of early voting. Huge increase over prior election periods. Huge increase. On Monday of this week, they had almost 400 people vote on just Monday. Yesterday when I was in there, sorry, I had to go over there and check to see what's going on. Yesterday when I was in there, it was about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, and they had 4 voting booths set up, and they were all busy, and there were backups at each booth.
Before we wrap up, Randy, for people who'd like to take a look at Idaho Weekly Briefing, where do they go?
They would go to www.ridenbaugh.com, RIDENBAUGH.
And you don't have another county meeting probably until after Election Day.
We're going to have one election night on November the 8th. We're going to have a county meeting, and we're going to have some televisions and some treats, and we're going to all get together and cheer and yell and clap and jump up and down.
We want to thank both of you for coming by today, and we'll have to figure out another big event where we can do this again.
This is fun. Thanks. Yeah. It's always good to see you, Randy.
Good to be here.
Coming up next, it's news from Fox. That's at 10 o'clock. And, of course, tomorrow morning, just want to make a quick point. We're going to have a couple of guests on the air with us. In fact, going to have some people talking about the possibility of building a new arena or maybe even a stadium complex in Twin Falls County. Clark Kaufman bringing along some people from the fairgrounds to talk about that. In the meantime, God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning, straight up at 8 o'clock.